Hey everybody, this is Pastor Megan at Grace Lutheran in San Francisco, and this is Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. And at Grace, we worship every Sunday, 10:30 a.m. You can join us in person. You can check us out. Listen, God is calling. Listen, can you hear it? All right. Well, I guess now you know there's a second person, and their name is...
I don't know how to turn that off. When my phone rings, my ringer is off on my phone, but it rings on my computer. So it happened. It seems to manage to happen like once a week. Anyway, I'm Pastor Dan Tisdale. I am at First Lutheran in Gypsum, Colorado. That's on just off of I-70 in the mountains of Colorado, sort of near Vail. And we worship at 9 a.m. on Sunday morning, one worship service. And our Facebook page and our web page are both First Lutheran of Gypsum, all one word. And Wednesday nights we meet at 6:30 for simple supper, and we're reading through the Psalms right now, which I'm really digging. Having a good time reading through the Psalms. So come out and check it. And we have other stuff going on too, but you know.
Well, this is Lent. Lent is a season of time when the church kind of slows down a little bit and tries to help people reorient themselves towards God if they've gotten off track. There is an emphasis in a lot of Christian traditions in giving money to the poor and caring for those who are vulnerable. It's also a time of taking stock and maybe asking for forgiveness for things if one needs to do that. If you're familiar with the anonymous groups, you could say it's the step that we're working at this time. And it's helping us get ready for this journey towards the cross that Jesus is going to take, and then will culminate in the celebration of Easter. The idea is that you have to have this time of remembering, like Exodus wandering, where the Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 days or for 40 years. And so we, for 40 days, celebrate Lent. Some people count differently. There are folk who count during the season of Lent the every weekday and Saturday. So Sundays are off because they're little mini Easters, and that makes up the 40 days of Lent. There are other people who start counting a little bit later, and it's every single day, and you don't get Sundays off, but then you are done with your 40 days when Triduum comes, which is a 3-day celebration. Monday, Thursday, which is a washing of feet. Good Friday, which is the day that Jesus dies on the cross, and then like a Holy Saturday, which is an ancient feast remembering not only the creation of the world, but all of time. And it can be a very long service if you do it in an Orthodox space. A lot of, I think, Lutheran spaces these days do as much as they think members will show up for. It's very hard to get people to come to church at all regularly. And so there are some places that are bringing back all of those days of worship to celebrate the different days. And then there's other spaces that kind of on Palm Sunday, you get a Palm Passion mashup, so that if people don't want to come Thursday, Friday, Saturday, when Jesus rises from the dead, they got a tiny taste of that whole process. And so it really depends on where you go to church, how the cycle of Lent will happen in that space. This year is called Year B, and it's just a 3-year cycle of biblical readings. And usually we're focusing on the Gospel of Mark. However, the ye oldie timey folk who put the lectionary together, my guess is that they thought Mark didn't go dark enough to be Lent worthy. Lent really, for some people, was a time of like really suffering and fasting. And for medieval folk, it was even a time of and monastic folk, a time of actually hurting yourself physically so that you could join in Jesus's suffering. And so there is a difficult kind of dark past that goes along with this idea that you should really suffer throughout Lent. Mark doesn't suffer a lot. when Jesus dies, he dies so fast that they have to like poke him to check that he's still alive. Like Caesar doesn't believe that he's dead when they ask to put him in the grave. And there aren't any words about blood. In fact, the only words about blood in the crucifixion stories happen in the Gospel of Matthew. It's absolutely nothing like the Passion of the Christ film, if you have seen it, of which I have heard is all about the blood and the guts. I've refused to see it because it's seems more into making people want to harm themselves or think that they are bad, and that's why God is great. And it's not my cup of tea. I've had enough people in my own life tell me that they think I'm bad. So I didn't need a movie to have that kind of awareness. I have pondered it to its fullest depths. So because Mark doesn't go very deep into the crucifixion, it literally happens super fast. And Jesus honestly seems more interested in freeing demons from humans and separating the things of God from the things of human than healing people just kind of straight off. There's stories in Mark's gospel about people having to touch Jesus to get healed because Jesus wasn't interested in touching them. And so it's a peculiar gospel. It's also one where Jesus is not as proactive as some of the other gospels. In some of the other gospels, for example, Jesus is going to go and instigate conflict and fights. In Mark's gospel, people are going to be coming to him for picking arguments and trying to trick him. And it's less clear that Jesus wanted to like run towards death in Mark's gospel. That's not the case in Luke and Matthew, and particularly not the case in John. And this story that we have from John for this week, which is about Jesus with a whip and driving out all the sheeps and the people in the marketplace and the bankers, is a peculiar one if you understand how the ancient temple worked. So ancient temples were not ransacked because they thought the God of the Israelites was super powerful. That's what the Bible says, because it's their favorite God. And so, of course, that's why they were ransacking the temple. It's because their God was super powerful. But from the perspective of the people who were ransacking them, they were doing it because the temples were the banks. They weren't separate buildings. And so if you kept all of your money in the holiest place because that's where God was going to keep it safe because it was a part of a community chest, then of course there are money changers in this place. Of course there is a need for someone to change your money because they're not participating in the same kind of money that Caesar has. The money that has Caesar's name on it is the kind that you use to pay taxes. The money that you use at the temple is a completely different type of money. And unless you had a group of disciples who hung out with you and one of them was a tax collector like Jesus had, you didn't have your own money changer that just wandered around with you, right? So that's a question. Was Jesus just privileged and he didn't need to go to a bank because he had his own banker?
Wow, I never thought of it.
Was that part of what's going on in this text? Jesus is also trying to get rid of all of the sacrificial animals that you would need in this space. So if you were someone that had a lot of free time to ponder, like a rabbi or a pastor like me, you might have more time to just be like, I wonder what market I should go and get this week's Easter stuff from. Like I literally spent 40 minutes yesterday looking in a catalog of which type of palm leaves we should have. Not everybody's got 40 minutes to ponder palm leaves, right? Jesus had time to ponder shopping and to go out and to be able to get stuff. It's not necessarily what the average person was able to do at that time. 93 to 96% of the people during Jesus's time lived in like desperate poverty. So being able to go to the temple and get all the items you needed right there at the Walmart temple probably was useful for people who had kids or who wanted to follow all of the rituals that were happening in that space. The interesting thing about this, though, is that here's what I think might be happening. So remember, I like Mark the best. In Mark's gospel, Jesus doesn't do this thing with a whip. Some people really love this. There's a lot of really progressive people, and they're like, my favorite image of Jesus is when he's got the whip and he's like, get out of here, patriarchy. Well, that might have been what was happening. But whenever I've traveled to countries and seen people selling things outside of the churches, it's not usually the patriarchy. It's usually the poor people who are selling things in those spaces. I tend to think that this is like a version of Jesus being tougher, right? Of Jesus being stronger. In Mark's gospel, he's like outside playing in the dirt with a stick. And he's like, look, they took all the widow's money. That's terrible. So he's like the snarky dude from across the street. That's how Jesus has this same conversation in the Gospel of Mark about like funds and taking advantage of people. In this text, he's like going in and he's separating things. And if you think about what it meant to, remember earlier I mentioned that Jesus was very interested in separating demons from people because it was separating the stuff of God from the stuff of humans. I think Jesus was proving himself as a Messiah by organizing and separating, because the God of the Hebrew Bible organized and separated. God separated water from dry land. God separated rainy things from dry things. God separated walking things from crawling things. That's a part of the creation and the ordering of God. And Jesus is very obsessed at separating things that have become confusing and have become divided. And so maybe this is Jesus participating in that creative action of God. But I also think that some people want their Jesus to look like Indiana Jones, right? Indiana and the hang, and he's coming. So that's where I think this story is about. But Dan's also got some ideas.
I do. I have to admit, reading through it, I didn't get too caught up in the whip. But one thing that's interesting for me about this text is that where it happens. So it happens at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. He's called a few disciples. He's been the wedding in Cana. And then all of a sudden which
is an exact opposite, right? Wedding in Cana is about like having more wine even after you're drunk. It's like excess of like frivolity. And then this is like the exact opposite prophetically of like, no more fun, everyone out of the temple. It's so seriousness here.
But I think there's a good context. John is the Gospel of John is an interesting gospel. I mean, I think part of the reason that John is used a lot of times in year B and the year of Mark is simply because Mark is a very, very short gospel. And so maybe not for someone who just translated the whole thing, it might be really long. But it's fairly short. So John fills in some of the gaps. And John John is not like the other three. The other three, so Matthew, this may be a shock to some people, I don't know. I think it's probably been said here at some point. Matthew and Luke used Mark as a reference. So there's a lot of parts, almost all of Mark is embedded in Luke and Matthew, but John is his own sort of thing. So I like that John gets pulled in here and there, throughout the 3-year lectionary, and more in Mark than the other 2 years because Mark is a shorter gospel. I like what you said about when this scene, and this scene happens, I believe, in all 4 gospels. When this happens, which is kind of rare actually, because of John being different. When the scene happens in other gospels, it happens right after he has come into Jerusalem during Holy Week, and he's going to be crucified later on that week, and it is sort of running toward death. I do believe that Jesus was actively setting up his own martyrdom to a certain degree. Now, what that means theologically, you can kind of debate, but he went out of his way to piss off all of that stuff happened when the army was in town. They're only in town here and there throughout the year. And this week, Passover week, was the time that the army was in town. So if you really want to piss people off, do it during the time when the army's there. This one is different because it happens earlier on. So I feel like in the other gospels, the message of the cleansing of the temple is that Jesus is running toward death, and Jesus is helping pave the way for his, not just his death, but also his resurrection and all the signs and stuff that points to that. However, in John, it happens early, and I like to think of John as a reformer. I mean, not John, Jesus as a reformer. Jesus, the central focus of Jesus' ministry, ironically, wasn't about, hey, I'm the Son of God. He rarely ever referred to that. He basically was going to the people in the temple, the people that were in charge, and saying, hey, maybe the stuff, the laws, a lot of the laws that we've been following for thousands of years, maybe they're outdated, and maybe we need to simplify and learn to love each other, because we've done the exact opposite with a lot of our laws. What our laws have gotten us to do is to figure out ways that we can exclude other people and become this exclusive kind of a club. And Jesus was saying that's not what this was ever intended to be. We've let our laws take over, and we need to simplify and reform what's going on here. So I think the cleansing of the temple being at the beginning of his ministry is sort of a symbolic, maybe cleaning up the Jewish house. And that's not to say that we don't love our Jewish brothers and sisters, but Jesus, it's almost like Jesus saying, okay, I'm going to do something different here, and it's not going to involve money changers in the temple, which was a questionable practice even then, right?
A questionable practice because they jacked up the price.
Right.
Because they made it more expensive because of the proximity to the place. It's like when you buy your baseball tickets at the stadium the day of the game.
Right, exactly. So I think part of the, maybe not the message, the specific message that Jesus is trying to give, but the message of the gospel writer is, this is the beginning of sort of a new way of thinking that will be more obvious as we go through Jesus's teachings and ministry and life in the 3 years after this. So in that sense, I don't like the fact that he's a little bit more violent and he has the whips and stuff, but I think the setup, the rationale behind it makes more sense to me. It's not the martyrdom, I'm going to go to the cross, look how brave I am, but it's more about, okay, it's almost like taking the dry erase board and wiping it off and saying, okay, now let's rewrite how we do things. He was reforming, and to have that be one of his first acts of ministry changes how I look at that event. So even if it was written word for word the same, it's not in all four Gospels. Just the fact that it's placed in a different order in John makes it mean something different to me. So,
well, I think what also is interesting in it is that the wedding in Cana, as a beginning to Jesus's ministry, in John's version, is interesting because it means that Jesus has to be told to start. Right? Jesus's mom has to say, get out there and do something. You know you can do this. And so to have the second thing Jesus does be really, really bold kind of can overcompensate for the idea that, like, you only did this because your mom made you.
I didn't think about that. You picture, like, if they had added a verse at the end of the chapter, maybe it said, his mom says, okay, I said start. I didn't say get crazy. Let's
yeah, right. So Jesus is a beginner reformer, right? And so, as often is the case, sometimes you have to figure out what is the right amount of reforming that is possible at any given time. There's a chemistry word called titration or titrate, and the idea is it's trying to find, when you're mixing chemicals, you don't want to get too much or you'll screw it up, and you don't want to get too little or you won't get the right reaction. And to titrate is to have just the perfect amount. It's just the perfect amount for the reaction that you're looking for. And so Jesus has yet to titrate his reforming and his being a Messiah in the world, right? He starts with too little, and then his mom's like, make some wine, dude. And then he goes to too much. And like us, when we're learning to do new things, if you've ever learned a new thing and you like try it a little bit and then you're like, this is my whole life. I'm going to only do this thing forever. I'm so amazing. I'm going to build my own airplane in my backyard, right? I never tried to do that, but I might have gone scuba diving a lot after learning how to scuba dive, right? So it's the equivalent of learning a new skill, really getting into it and wanting to do it a lot, and then having to like take a step back and get feedback from the community that you're participating in to see if it has the desired effect and to see if it's working. And I definitely think from that perspective, it's a very relatable action that Jesus is up to. And I also think if you're going to look back on this story and you have Jesus dying on the cross, and pretty much the only claim against Jesus in those trials is you said you were going to tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, right? And if that's going to be the thing that gets a Messiah killed, do you want your Messiah to like say it from like a mile up the road on top of a mountain at the Mount of Olives, like Jesus does in some of the other gospels, because his disciples are like, look at those stones, they're so big. And then Jesus is like, do you see those stones? Not one stone will be left on stone. Like, it's a cool speech, but no one's there, right? And it's really far away from the action. And this is a story that's in your face. It's a Jesus who is in charge of the story rather than letting the oppressive powers be in charge of the story. And so it really depends on what your understanding of God is. John's a Gnostic text, which means it's about it believes. So a Gnostic text comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means to know. And the idea is that if you know the right magic words, then you get to go to heaven. You do not pass go, do not collect $200. You get everything you want. And so John is interested in teaching you the right words. And so John's text begins with a bang to be like, this dude's the Messiah. There's no question about it. This really cool thing happened. Like, he's badass. Just get on board. Right. And then once you're on board from the beginning, you're going to listen with the kind of attention that you might at a superhero movie, rather than the kind of attention you might have at like a slow drama that's going to win the Oscars, to memorize the words that John wants you to memorize so that you can go to heaven forever.
Yeah. I wanted to quickly touch on a couple of the other texts, but I promise I'll be quick. The Exodus text.
I have to go in 10 minutes and get cavities filled.
I know. I'll be quick, I promise.
No, you're fine.
The Exodus text, part of the reason I thought of this is because we're talking about John. I think it's important to the people who made up the lectionary connected the text. Sometimes I don't always get how they connected them, but sometimes it makes sense. And with the Exodus text, it is talking about the laws. There's not too many people criticizing like the 10 Commandments as a whole, but criticizing the law. And Jesus was literally criticizing the law. I find it interesting that the Old Testament text, the Hebrew Bible text from Exodus, is the 10 Commandments. So it's sort of, if you mirror that with John, it's him saying, okay, it also makes more sense that he's sort of setting up this consideration, which is, I think, great during Lent, because it's a time that we do consider. We spend more time sort of considering our laws and our values and things like that. But more importantly, the Corinthians text, I think also gives sort of an apology for Jesus in a sense, because I think I never really, especially early in my life, it's a tough sort of passage to understand. The cross is a stumbling block for people. But especially as I've been a pastor and I've had time, like you said, time to think about it and time to preach about it, the whole idea of Christianity, especially the cross and the theology of the cross, is really countercultural, because within our faith we highlight our vulnerability and our weakness, and we call that strength, and it is strength. And I think part of what's going on in the temple there is, it's not him saying, look how tough I am, I'm beating everybody with a whip and sending them out, but it's also a little bit of vulnerability. You know, that both the wedding at Cana and the cleansing of the temple have elements where you can argue that Jesus is sort of vulnerable in a way. You know, the fact that he has to be told by his mother to go to do, like, it's kind of like, oh yeah, maybe I should do that. Like that's actually a little bit of vulnerability. It wasn't like he just, because he's the Son of God, he just knew, oh, of course I know I should do this. He had to be reminded by his mother. And in the temple, yeah, he does go over the top, and some of the stuff he says is difficult, but I think there's an element of, I'm going to throw everything at you guys, the disciples, and see what sticks. And I'm not always going to get everything right. And that's a hard thing for us to say about Jesus, that, oh, maybe he didn't get everything right. But there's vulnerability in, not just in the cross, but in a lot of what he said and did. He was willing to sort of figure things out sometimes along the way, you know. And that's, to say that Jesus, Son of God, was willing to do that is pretty amazing, I think. So,
and I think the hardest thing that there is to do, even after you've like figured out the path you're supposed to take, is to like stick with it when everyone thinks you're crazy. Right. Because like for me, the Corinthians text has always been one of my favorites, because I got no shortage of people who think that what I'm doing is foolish, right? Or who think, oh, that's not going to work, and who tell me about it on a regular basis. And I've had to find a way to like discern within myself when ideas are coming from like a call of what I'm supposed to do, and when ideas are just maybe too much for right now. And I'm definitely not perfect at it. I definitely have a lot of internal self-doubt, which gets exacerbated when other people kind of add to that questioning. And so I have lots of ways that I have to like check in with people and figure out if my foolishness is true foolishness, or if it's some sort of like crafty spiritual wisdom. And it's hard to figure out. The interesting thing I think about the Corinthians text is about the word play in the original Greek, because when the Corinthians text is talking about different kinds of wisdom and different kinds of learning and different kinds of knowledge. There's like wisdom that's foolishness and wisdom that is like super wise. He's probably talking about like scribes being
right
enemies of Christianity, because they tended to be on the side of the upper class, and they were really interested in helping to protect the Sadducees stay in power.
Well, also on the side of the law, right? On the side of, sure. So it all sort of connects in a way in that sense, right?
But the word usage, where Paul is eschewing eloquent wisdom, or the two Greek words that when you put them together are Sophia, logo. So logos is the word that Jesus says he is. And Sophia is the word for Holy Spirit when used separately. But when put together, they create a Greek word that's about like overly fancy talk. And I think it's really interesting wordplay if you know what those two words mean separately in this context. And I don't know if that's intentional by Paul, or if it's just one of those times where we see his being a new convert coming through, that like maybe he didn't know he had this funny wordplay, that he was like eschewing something that probably everybody else would have thought was really great.
It just, something just occurred to me too, that the idea, because ultimately cleansing the temple was at least somewhat about justice, because the people that were getting robbed essentially were the poor people that were changing their money. It wasn't the people in power. And so I don't know, maybe there's sort of an underlying message of justice here too, that being so strict to the adherence of the old law was not providing justice for the people that needed it the most.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of ways in which Jesus challenges the 10 commandments in his conversation. So there's an idea about the Sabbath and how you should honor it. And Jesus very, very often is doing things on the Sabbath that people ought not do. And his argument is that the Sabbath is made for people, not people for the Sabbath. Meaning that he thinks you should rest when your body needs it, not just because someone told you the rule was to rest on a particular day. And so there's an interesting way in which Jesus is making even some of the most important rules up for conversation. And I think it's good for us to talk about, because the habit of writing words on stone is not unique to Moses, but during that time when Moses was around, when God spoke to people, they wrote it. That speech was written in stone. So if a god of any variety spoke to someone, they would have done it on stone, and it would not have meant that those words were permanent, and that's why they were written in stone, that they should never be changed. It's just that's how you proved it was from God, is because it was on stone. And the 10 Commandments themselves are written in a way that assume that there are other gods that exist, but that our loyalty should be to this one particular God. And so it's an interesting, I think it's an interesting part of the conversation. Another fun thing that's in the 10 Commandments and this Exodus reading that you might not know from a historical point of view is that part about like honoring your mom and your father is justice for women, because normally they wouldn't have been perceived on the same level as the men. And so to be able to say honor your mother and your father, there's not necessarily this hierarchy. And so it's a pretty cool thing to kind of think about that. And it seems like this is the kind of law that is passed down in these commandments from the study that I've done on them, and particularly from feasting on the word, is that it's not the kind of law that would have been like a household law, like every house has to follow this law. It wasn't a temple law, but it was more like the kind of laws that you would create before you founded a city. So it was like constitutional law. So, right? Do not do anything to infringe upon the bearing of arms. Do not look at your neighbor's wife in a way that will be actionable by you. Like, you can think they're pretty, but not to an excess, right? And so these are laws about forming community. They're city-state laws. But the city-state that we're talking about is a particular city-state that's going to orient itself around this particular one God. Cool. And it's a new thing because they were wandering in the desert. They didn't have a city anymore. They have left Egypt. They had previously worshipped a lot of gods, and they were now, as Moses was coming down from this mountain, picking one that was going to be their monogamous lifetime partner. And so what Moses is proposing here is like the constitutional meeting where everybody went to Philadelphia and they drafted it together, and then he came down from the mountains and said, hey, look, God did this thing, and now we're going to be a city. Let's do this. And if you read the rest of Exodus, you'll know they don't follow those rules, like, ever. Not even once, right? So they're constitutional rather than like prescriptive or like do this or die kind of rules. Yeah. Which is why I think Jesus can continue to be negotiating them later. The end. I have to go get some cavities filled. Sorry, everybody. I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next week. Do you want to say goodbye, Dan?
Goodbye. I had my cavity yesterday. So.
Good job. Self-care. Go do it. It's not fun, but do it anyway.